Hello, my name is Rafael Nunez. I'm a professor of cognitive science at the University of California, San Diego, where I'm also a faculty member of the Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropogeny, CARTA, as well as the Mathematics and Science Education doctoral program and the Science Studies doctoral program. And the big question for my presentation today is the following: is there biological enculturation? Now, in a previous part of the Summer Institute, you may have read for this seminar, the paper that was entitled, "Is There Really an Evolved Capacity for Number?" and eventually for mathematics. And that in itself is a big question. Now, I take this question now to a next level in the discussion today because I want to show the relationship between culture and biology, which usually are seen as separate realms. And in that article, you may have seen at the end of exchange the term biological enculturation, which is what I would like to unpack with you now. Let me start then by invoking the idea of tool making. So hominins began to make lithic tools about 3 million years ago, lithic meaning stone tools. And by hominins, I mean here like species ancestrals to humans, including the genera Homo and Australopithecus. So around 2.6 million years ago, we start to see materials like Oldowan tools, which are very rough and basic tools, essentially broken stones used as tools with some edges. But a million years later, 1.6 million we start to see the so-called Acheulean hand axes, which are stones that are much more elaborated, that need much more work and a shaping of the actual stone with many little touches and so on. So this is sometimes taken as some intelligent behavior, making a tool, which may have started then way before humans, which, depending on who you ask, they've been around on Earth for about 200,000 years. But then the question is, well, other species with much smaller brains also make things using materials from their environment and using their bodies in precisely coordinated actions, intelligent behaviors, like beavers building dams in very specific ways, birds birding amazing nests, fish changing the structure of the seafloor for mating behaviors, and termites building these amazing structures and so on. So the question that we want to ask is, are these cases of material building and different from the human or the hominin case? And if yes, how are they different from hominins' lithic tools? So here's then when we may be tempted to go into what are the biological traits that would lead certain species to do certain kinds of things, and what are the cultural traits, on the other hand, that may lead, let's say, humans to make tools in the way we do today. So here's what I invite you to maybe rethink the relationship between biology and culture in order to understand the evolution of capacities and know-hows. So let's take, for example, behaviors that we may observe today in modern world, like windsurfing or piano playing or gathering around a bonfire at the moment of sunset, for example, or enjoying, let's say, cappuccino in the morning with some milk, which comes from a different species, a domesticated species. Here's when we start to see then that the incredibly rich tangle of biology and culture, in particular in the human species. So this tangle comes in at least two main forms. One is the gene-culture coevolution, which manifests specifically in the genotype. And another form is developmental plasticity, which manifests more in the phenotype. So an example of the first case would be lactase persistence, for example, which, about 7,000 years ago, groups in Africa and other groups later in Europe independently under really severe evolutionary pressures, they developed a genetic mutation that would allow for the digestion of milk past into adulthood. That's called the lactose persistence. And not all human groups have this mutation, and therefore not all human groups can digest milk in the same way. So that is an example of the domestication, a cultural activity, de facto changing the genome of the human species. Another good example is seafloor hunting that we observe among the Bajau in Southeast Asia, who literally go hunting under the water, and they can hold their breath for many minutes, 10 minutes or more, sometimes 150 feet under the water with amazing pressure. So this is also, again, they have a genetic mutation that have been under severe evolutionary pressures selected for. And again, we see a form of cultural activities de facto shaping the genome. But we're interested in some other form which actually acts much faster, which is developmental plasticity acting on the phenotype in individuals. And this is what we then observe when we have piano playing, windsurfing, reading and writing, and so on. And those are all behaviors and capacities that are not biologically endowed, that evolve outside of natural selection, requiring the support of biologically evolved preconditions, which are in a domain general. They're not specific for piano playing, for windsurfing, or let's say snowboarding, but they are generic, balance keeping or acoustic discrimination, and so on and so forth. Now, what is interesting is that these behaviors and capacities are driven by cultural preoccupations, mediated by symbolic reference, which allow for efficient learning mechanisms, but all of them require enculturation. And by enculturation, what I mean is this gradual acquisition of the characteristics and norms of a culture or group by an individual, or sometimes by another culture. In humans, Homo sapiens, this is largely accomplished via linguistically mediated learning that takes place in ontogeny. This is during the lifespan of an individual. And in humans is supported by a central nervous system, a brain that develops during decades after birth, really making it a social organ, as neuroscientist Walter Freeman once said. So a very peculiar aspect of this type of activities and capacities that we have is that we learn them through symbolic reference. So here's when we have to kind of rethink the relationship between biology and culture to interpret the evolution of these capacities and know-hows. In the article you already read, we saw how that happens for the case of quantification and number, but I want to also now point it to something much more basic, which is declarative pointing. So let me just recap briefly for quantification and number, in which symbolic reference again plays a crucial role. We can see that, for example, let's say if we want to know why is it so many cultures that have number or counting system would have a base 10, and the usual answer would be, oh, because we have 10 fingers. But not so fast, because many species have 10 fingers in the upper limbs, and that is called pentadactylism. Penta, 5, dactyls, fingers, 5 fingers in one limb. Gorillas, chimpanzees, macaques, orangutans, raccoons, many species would have that particular evolved anatomical morphological feature, that trait. However, that by itself, without symbolic reference, doesn't serve any purpose for finger counting or any numerical activity. So even when we look at how fingers are used for finger counting, for example, we see a huge, enormous variations among human cultures. In some cultures, let's say number 8 would be characterized by a symmetrical gesture like this, 4 and 4. In other cultures would be asymmetric, far and then completing with 3. Or other cultures even by pointing to this finger, the tip of the finger, because what you keep count is the number of joints, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8. So just having the fingers, morphologically speaking, doesn't give you a number system. What you need is symbolic reference. And this is what you saw in that article, this important gap between what is biologically endowed, like capacities like subitizing and large quantity discrimination, which are based on perceptual features, how across that gap we have oral language and eventually written language developed for under, again, cultural preoccupations developed for exact symbolic quantification, namely number. So that's a passage from what is called quantical cognition, just about quantities and perceptions of quantity, to numerical cognition. So I want to move to the declarative pointing now, because here I want to go back to the hominins tool-making part of the story. And here's when we, by declarative pointing, we can now study what is called a deictic gesture that directs someone's attention to a shared reference. So the usual classic way in which you address someone's attention by looking at something and pointing with perhaps your index finger, for example. Now, why is this so special? Well, first, declarative pointing is distinctively human, at least is not observed in the wild in any other species that exists today on Earth. And I invite you to read a very interesting article by Mike Tomasello entitled, "Why Don't Apes Point?" So it seems that we are the only species that we would be doing this type of behavior. Now, importantly, number two is that it emerges in humans very early in ontogeny. So around 8 to 10 months already, human infants start to produce this type of deictic gestures, dragging the attention of the caregivers, the parents, for example. And this occurs before the appearance of the first words, which is about around the 12 months, around a year old. Another important characteristic of these pointings is that they don't have a fixed morphology. So it's not like we have like a reflex of putting our index finger out to point. We can point, of course, with our index finger, but we normally point with our thumb, depending on the directions. We can point with a pinky finger. We can point in some cultures with, lip protrusion, nose, head, or even we can point with tools like laser pointers and so on. So the recruitment of muscles and bodily parts for articulating a pointing are multiple. And the question is, how is it that we do it, and so efficiently and so fast? Pointing also is culturally shaped in the sense that in some cultures, if you're pointing to a moving object, you may have a different hand shape, like in certain Aboriginal Australian groups, or if you're pointing to plurality or many objects as opposed to one single object, you have different hand shapes. Or if you're giving directions as opposed to pointing to a person, you have different kinds of cultural hand shapes that will be recruited for those purposes. And importantly, for our discussion about intelligence, is that pointings normally in humans occur with abstract, imaginary, and complex reference. Usually they're non-visible reference, non-tangible objects, like pointing to where you live, even if it's 10 miles away, you can't see the place where you live, or you're pointing to the north, or you're pointing to God if you're a believer, or self-pointings and so on. And particularly interesting are those that occur with, for example, conceptual metaphor. For example, when we're talking about temporal reference, like past and future. So if we're talking about, let's say I'm talking about my childhood, I may point behind me with my thumb, for example, as if my childhood is somewhere behind my body, and as if the events have not occurred yet are somehow in front of me. And you may think that this is now universal again, in which for some biological reason, the neural populations recruited for keeping track of front and back are somehow genetically built there. ready to be used for something like past and future, for example. But with Yves Switzer and colleagues, Carlos Cornejo and others, we documented, for example, that the Aymara of the Andes, they produce gestures and point in sort of the opposite way. So for old times and past times, they would point towards the front. And for things like next year or tomorrow or the next rainy season, they would point behind them. So future for them is conceived as being behind and the past as in front. So showing that then is not a universal feature for how we recruit space. And in another study of the Yubno of Papua New Guinea, along with Kenzie Cooper-Ryder and Hugh Bassman, we documented that this group wouldn't even use the body as a reference, but they would use topographic information, uphill and downhill, up valley and down valley considerations of the terrain for anchoring and recruiting and grounding the notions of future and past. In their case, they would point towards downhill when talking about events that already occurred, like something yesterday, and uphill in cases when events have not occurred yet, namely they're in the future. The point is that even though our body has all kinds of neural populations that will be tracking objects that are in front and back or behind and so on, or tracking terrain declivity and so on, those are not immediately ready to be anchoring, let's say, abstract concepts. And the symbolic reference there will be mediated by cultural preoccupations and cultural normativity. And that would be then the result of these abstract concepts, like, for example, temporal concepts. So coming back to now my tool story, in this figure, you can see that on the left, you have, let's say, 4 million years to zero. That's the timeline. So this, what you see here is, let's say, the hominin, some selected hominin species that existed before Homo sapiens. This is already after the separation with the common ancestor with chimpanzees, which occurred around 5.5 million years ago. But now this is now just the branch that is somehow leading to the only species that is now living, let's say, which is Homo sapiens. Now, what you can see here is the Oldowan tools, for example, they existing from 2.6 to 1.6 millions. But is this during this period, from 1.6 million years ago, where you start to have quite a bit of things happening. So on the one hand, you have the Acheulean tools, which really require much more of a self-control, inhibition of counterproductive impulses, because when you start building, you may just do one too strong of a cut, and then you destroy the whole tool. So you really need this inhibition and self-control for how you're doing the shaping the stone. And this is critical to many types of cognitive skills, and is correlated with larger brain size in many species, and cranial capacity, which here is depicted with the size of these black dots. Now, importantly, around that time also is when we start to see controlled fire, which is, so it's about 800,000 years ago. We have very strong evidence now that there is not just use of fire, but controlled fire. And this over time, then allowing for hominins to start cooking or changing the landscape of what they can eat, which allow them also to spread over new terrains where they find different types of food, and de facto literally outsourcing digestion to things that otherwise you could not be digesting, like, for example, raw yams or something like that. The idea here is that when we are, let's say, selecting tools for making a hand axe, then think about what would happen when you're trying to, let's say, teach or involve another member of your community to pick the right stone. There would probably be symbolic reference in the form of a deictic gesture. And this is something we do not observe. We do not observe with chimpanzees. You do not observe that in, let's say, nut cracking behavior, in which caregivers would never say something like point for the type of anvil or the type of not that they would be, the kids should learn how to use. They would have to, basically they're on them just by themselves, finding out and copying, but never using symbolic reference in the form of declarative pointing. So presumably, this is something that started to occur way before humans, perhaps 1.6 million years ago, and this is part of who we are today. So in order to understand the tangle of biology and culture in human evolution, I want to bring this quote by geneticist and evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who in 1962 said, human evolution has two components, the biological or organic and the cultural or superorganic. These components are neither mutually exclusive nor independent, but interrelated and interdependent. Human evolution cannot be understood as a purely biological process, nor can it be adequately described as a history of culture. It is the interaction of biology and culture. So many of the behaviors that then we see today, like reading and writing, or as I was saying, snowboarding or windsurfing and so on, they really emphasize how enculturated practices are possible and mediated by a biological apparatus that allows them for or supports them. So this emphasizes the cultural driving force that harnesses necessary biologically evolved preconditions, which are neither precursors nor domain specific. They focus on the phenotypical biological plasticity that makes it possible ontogenetically. And this is when we see that biological enculturation then occurs in this peculiar hypersocial animal, Homo sapiens. We saw the example for exact quantification in the paper you read, but now also in this simple motor action, not for instrumental purposes, but for declarative pointing, which also supports, for example, imaginary and abstract concepts like temporal construals, and then probably has been with us as hominins since the time of lithic tool making all the way to reading and writing today. And this seems to be very different from material making in beavers, birds, termites, and other species. So it seems to be a signature of hominin intelligence or intelligences. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to discuss this with you during our session. Thank you.